So today, we're continuing our search for the best affordable smoothing plane for the home game woodworker. So far in this series, I've only looked at metallic Bailey-style planes, because I think those are generally the one that everybody should own. But you know what? I need to throw in at least one wooden plane before I wrap this series up. Why do I need to look at wooden planes? Well, because they're awesome. Not only are wooden planes durable, effective, and simple, they're also really lightweight, and they glide smoothly against the wood. They have way less friction and don't require lubrication. So a lot of people who are getting into woodwork should consider having at least one wooden plane in the arsenal. And that brings us to today's plane. This is the Pinnie Continental smoothing plane. Continental because this plane dominates in countries like Russia, France, Poland, Germany, Estonia, and pretty much every part of Europe that's not England. In England and in America, we're much more likely to find this style, which is called the coffin plane. It's kind of a smooth and sleek design, and it's more familiar to a lot of woodworkers. But if you've never seen the Continental style before, don't let the weird looks fool you. The main thing that makes this plane look so odd is this giant horn in the front. But this horn is a really convenient handle. You grip the plane like this, one hand behind the iron and then the other hand in front of the handle. Because this handle is so beefy and ergonomic, it actually lets you put a ton of force into the plane with your non-dominant hand. Now, having a handle on a plane, that's nothing new. A Bailey-style plane has a front handle, but it's not designed to put a lot of force into it. With this style of plane, you're doing almost all of your pushing with your right arm and just kind of steering the plane a little bit with your left arm. In contrast, when you grab the Continental style plane, you're pushing pretty much equally with both hands. That gives you a lot of control and it equalizes the pushing force. You're not putting nearly as much strain on your elbow. That can be a big help. This plane has a bunch of features that I really like. The main body is European beech, a stable, traditional choice, and it's laminated to a big sole made out of hornbeam. This is an extremely dense, heavy wood that's going to wear very slowly over the years. It's also got a metal strike button in the back here, which means that I can do all of my adjusting with a regular metal hammer. That's really handy. The iron and the chip breaker are really thick and heavy. They look like high quality, but I'm going to have to sharpen and prepare them and give them a try before I'm totally sure. The other thing that's interesting about this plane is that it has a super high pitch. Most of my planes are pitched at 45 degrees, which is called common pitch because it's so common. This plane is pitched at 55 degrees, which should make it a little bit harder to push, but also much better for twisty, interlocked grain on exotic woods or difficult boards. This plane should perform better for difficult planing tasks. The last really interesting thing about this plane is the mouth on it is huge. It is so big that I can look through it and see you. You need to clean your house, by the way. It's getting dirty. And this plane also has a number of features that I'm less excited about. For one thing, it was clearly made with a bunch of milling and shaping machines, and after they did all the rough shaping to the plane, they didn't sand it, and then they sprayed on a coat of some sort of hard gloss lacquer. And that means the grain raised up a lot, and there are a lot of places on this plane where the surface finish is very rough. It's definitely going to give me blisters. They did a bunch of different things to try and round the plane and make it ergonomic, but they didn't do it very thoughtfully. There are a lot of spots on this plane where there are little things that stick out, there are sharp edges, there are corners, and there are a lot of places that just don't feel good in the hand. So what I need to do is just kind of rework the whole plane. I'm going to sand off all of that hard finish. I'm going to use rasps, chisels, and files to work down all of the corners that I don't like, get rid of all the right angles, all the places where it pokes me in the hand. I'm also going to ease all the sharp edges and make them less likely to get chipped during use. Then I'll refinish the whole plane in boiled linseed oil. That's going to allow the plane to breathe and get acclimated to humidity changes really quickly, and it's just going to be a nice, friendly finish for the hand. Once all of that's done, I can turn my attention to the iron and the chip breaker. So the iron on this plane is pretty much good news all around. I took it to a piece of sandpaper glued down to glass and just gave it a couple of back and forth strokes, and right away the back of the iron was flat, especially the half-inch really close to the blade like this. I could have stopped right there if I had wanted to, but I was curious how good the iron was, so I gave it several more strokes and I was able to flatten almost the entire back and bring it up to a polish very quickly. This iron was already very close to being flat, and that's a sign of quality. It's also a very thick, stout stout piece of steel, and that's a nice thing to see too. So I took it over to my oil stones and I quickly honed it up and stropped it, and then I took it over to my arm and shaved a few hairs, and the hairs like leapt off my arm. I gave it a pretty quick, casual honing, and this thing is much sharper than most of the inexpensive irons that I see. It's notably better than most of the irons I've looked at in this series. If only the chip breaker were as good as the iron. It starts off looking okay. It's a nice thick piece of steel with a good curvature and a nice stout piece of hardware. And I was able to sharpen a knife edge on it, hone it on my stones, and strop off the burr just like I normally would with no trouble. And I got a really good fit between the iron and the chip breaker in just a couple of minutes. But here's the problem. This screw that holds the iron and the chip breaker together, it should be tapped at an angle. It should go out a little bit like that. Instead, it's dead flat. Let me put this together with the iron, and I'll show you why that's a problem. When the two pieces are fitted together like this, you can see that the chip breaker screw only actually contacts the iron in the front here. If it were tapped at the correct angle, you'd be getting contact with the underside of the screw all the way around the iron. So when you go to tighten it down, only the front part of the screw touches. Let me show you why that's a problem. As I'm tightening this down, the chip breaker is getting a little bit squirrely on me. It's wanting to move quite a bit because it's not bearing down equally. I'm going to keep tightening it until I've got a pretty good fit, but at this point, the chip breaker has gotten very cockeyed in relationship to the blade. Now this isn't a huge deal. I'm just going to take my screwdriver and give the chip breaker a whack. Now it's pretty straight. Now I'll tighten it down a little bit more and adjust it laterally a couple more times. What's happening here, as I'm tightening it, is the chip breaker is getting squashed flatter against the blade, and the underside of that screw is making much better contact with the iron. Now it's a good, solid unit, and I'm pretty happy with it. It needs a little bit of adjustment that way. While you're futzing around with it, you might have the chip breaker pull back from the edge of the blade a little bit. That's no problem. Flip the whole thing over, take your screwdriver, and adjust it by just whacking that screw a couple times. This is a handy trick that I picked up from Richard McGuire, the English Woodworker. He has a great channel. I will link to him down in the description. After I've made a couple of adjustments, my iron assembly is ready to go. We can go ahead and plane. But just like any metallic plane, a wooden plane needs a dead flat sole if it's going to work right. Most people just plane the soles of their wooden planes flat. But what if this is your first plane? What do you do then? No big deal. Grab your plane, iron, and wedge. Put the iron and the wedge in the plane and tighten up the wedge so that the iron is well retracted into the body. Check it with a scrap of wood and be really sure that your freshly sharpened edge isn't sticking out the bottom of that plane. Then just pull over that same sheet of sandpaper and glass, color your plane in with pencil, and go back and forth on it until all the pencil lines disappear. It took me about 5 minutes, and now my plane is dead flat. I should also mention that I bought this plane about 3 weeks ago and just left it sitting in a corner of the shop so it could absorb moisture, get rid of moisture, whatever, and do whatever moving it was going to do. I don't expect this plane to move a lot now that it's fully acclimatized. You might want to let your plane do the same thing. Now that we've got a sharpened iron, a fitted chip breaker, and a flat, true plane body, we're ready to start testing. If you've never adjusted a wood-bodied plane before, I can teach you how to do it in about 30 seconds. I'm going to take my iron and insert it into the throat of the plane. I keep my finger underneath to keep the iron from falling out. It's perfectly safe. I've never been cut doing this. Then I'm going to insert my wedge and give it a couple of nice taps with my hammer. Then I'll take the plane and just sight down. And I can see what's going on is I have way too much iron sticking out and it's not even across the plane. So there's a strike button on the back. I'll hit that a couple of times and then tap my wedge to retighten it. Still got too much iron. So a couple of stronger taps and maybe a little bit of finger adjusting. Tighten up that wedge and then I will sight down the plane, and I see that my plane iron needs a little bit of lateral adjustment. It is sticking up a little bit too far on this side. So I'll just tap with the hammer to bring it into line, and now it's looking pretty good. Another quick tap, and you can just take your thumb and sort of feel very gently how much iron you've got. Anytime you loosen the iron or bring it back, always follow up with 1 or 2 taps to the wedge to keep that seated. If everything went well, this plane should cut. I have a narrow piece of ash in the vise. Let's see what happens. Yep, it totally cuts, but I've got a little too much iron. Brand new planes typically take a little time to settle in and adjust really nicely. This one is just like other new wooden planes I've owned. It's a little tricky right in the beginning, but it gets easy really quickly. Let's see. Not bad. That's a pretty decent shaving. I'll make a couple more little adjustments to the plane, and we'll run it through its paces on a bunch of different woods. I started out planing the narrow edge of a piece of ash, and the Continental smoother produced nice shavings, but I kept having problems at the end of the piece. The plane would sort of hang up and then dip off the edge sort of suddenly. And what I noticed was that the super wide mouth of this plane was actually so big that the end of the wood was falling into the plane's mouth, and then the plane would nosedive off the end. Of course, there's a simple solution to this. When you're planing the edge of a board, you just need to skew the plane. That allows the iron to ride across the end of the board without digging in. No more problems. But it was still a weird and annoying thing to run across. Next, I wanted to do a large face grain surface, so I grabbed a wide board of red oak. I was pretty pleased with the way the plane was performing. It left a smooth and fairly shimmery surface, but then I was pleasantly surprised to discover that I was actually going against the grain. And I was still getting a really good surface. For against the grain work, this plane was performing actually really well. I flipped the board around and planed it again, and then the surface went from good to being excellent. So in this instance, the plane worked very well. Next, I tried a piece of walnut, and there were no surprises here. The wood planed really easily, and the surface the plane left was excellent and very smooth. After digging around in my scrap bin for a while, I came out with this old hunk of sapele that I haven't used for anything because the grain is really squirrely and this piece was very difficult to work with. It's got a mixture of hardwood and sapwood, and that can be a problem for planing. So this plane performed, kind of the way I would expect on this. The surface that I got was all right. I turned the board around a couple different times. I got one pretty big spot of deep tear out, and I figured I was going against the grain when that happened. So I flipped the board around again, and taking a light shaving, I went over it, and then when I was sure I was going with the grain, the end results were fine. Not amazing, but definitely fine. To wrap up my test, I pulled out this piece of cherry. I deliberately chose a piece that was rough sawn and had heavy marks on one face. This piece also has a knot right in the middle of the face. The grain is going to change direction right there, and that's going to be a prime location for tear out and other planing problems. Right off the bat, I was very impressed with the Continental Smoother's ability to get quickly through those saw marks and leave a smooth and shimmery surface. But right around the knot, I got exactly what you would expect. Fairly severe tear out. I went over the piece a couple of times, and generally the tear out got better the longer I was working on it, but it didn't go away. Just for a comparison, I grabbed my trusty Stanley No. 4 and went over the same board in the same way, and I got, more or less the same results. I still had tear out over the same area. The actual tearing of the fibers seemed to get smaller and shallower as I went at it with the Stanley, but that could also be because the wood was changing as I planed away more of the troublesome wood. So now, let's get down to business. Should you buy this plane? Is it a really good value? Well, honestly, I'm not totally sure. Now, it has the lightweight and easy gliding characteristics of every wooden plane that I've ever used. It comes pretty well fitted, straight from the factory, and the price is reasonable. At $60 with free shipping, this costs a lot less than a lot of other planes you might get. But it's also the most expensive budget plane I've looked at so far, and it's not a standout performer compared to the other ones. Now, the biggest issues that I have are with the iron and the chip breaker. The iron itself is excellent. I wish all my planes had irons this good. But the fit of the chip breaker and all the futzing around you have to do, whacking it with the screwdriver, that is a pain, and it's a huge time waster. So I'm not a fan of that. I guess the last thing I have to figure out is, what do I think of the high pitch of the iron combined with the enormous mouth? What effect does that actually have? Well, I think they sort of cancel each other out. This high-pitch iron does seem to offer some benefits on some woods, and it allows you to plane effectively against the grain or fight tear out in certain species, but definitely not all of them. But I think a lot of the effect that you get from the high pitch of the